In drafting the Constitution in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, the Virginia delegation to the Constitutional Convention played an extraordinarily important role. 7 Virginia delegates had assembled there before the convention even had a quorum to begin discussing the proposals for a new constitution, and they would meet, as George Mason wrote, for 2 or 3 hours every day in order to form a proper correspondence of sentiments before the convention even began. James Madison, of course, helped to lead this group, and when it came time to submit their plan to the convention, it was Edmund Randolph who had the honor of submitting a template for the new government, which we now call the Virginia Plan. The convention was even presided over by the most famous Virginian of all, George Washington. In so many ways, this was a constitutional plan of government that seemed to be the creation of leading men of Virginia. Over the winter of 1787-1788, as Virginians were still a few months away from their convention to debate the Constitution in the Old Dominion, there were 6 other states out of the required 9 that had already approved it. It looked as if a tide was rolling toward ratification of a new United States Constitution, and this was a Constitution that, as I said, Virginians took the lead in creating. It looked as if there should be no trouble to ratify it in Virginia. Things didn't turn out that way. In late February, New Hampshire's convention adjourned without approving the Constitution, beginning to show some signs of maybe a growing momentum of the opposition to the Constitution. And it became clear at about this time, too, that Patrick Henry, one of the most influential and certainly the most persuasive man in Virginia, was firmly opposed to the new plan of government. James Madison had known from the fall of 1787 that for the future of the Constitution of Virginia, as he said, much will depend on Mr. Henry. Henry had already informed George Washington in the early days of 1788 that he could not support ratification. The Virginia Assembly scheduled elections for March of 1788, and they set a number of 2 delegates for each of the state's 84 counties, plus a couple of delegates from the cities of Williamsburg and Norfolk. And they would meet in Richmond on Monday, June 2nd, 1788. As the March election approached, it was beginning to look a bit dicey for supporters of ratification in Virginia, so much so that James Madison, who was off in Congress, in the Confederation Congress in New York, was advised that he had better return home in order to ensure his chances of even being elected to the convention that was gathering in Richmond. If he didn't show up, he was told, he may find himself outvoted and an anti-federalist elected to the Virginia State Convention. Adding to the potential disastrous no vote in Virginia, and I should stop for a second and point out, Virginia was the most essential state to ratify the Constitution, without doubt. 1 out of every 6 Americans was a Virginian. It was the most populous state by far, and several leading Virginians were lining up alongside Henry to demand, at the very least, serious and prior amendments to this Constitution before they would consider ratifying it. Men like George Mason, author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, Governor Edmund Randolph, both of whom had attended the convention in Philadelphia but could not sign it, could not sign the final product. For Randolph's part, for instance, the reason was that he hated the idea of sending it to the states with nothing but a yes or no vote option. He really did want the states to have a chance to amend to propose changes. Men like Madison, Edmund Pendleton, George Wythe would lead the fray against this coterie of opponents of the Constitution. George Washington was not going to leave Mount Vernon. He was going to stay put there, but he also had sway. In short, if you think about the Patrick Henry, Mason, Randolph on one side, men like Madison, Pendleton, and Wythe on the other, Washington clearly from Mount Vernon, you had leading, educated, able men in Virginia on both sides of the issue. This really was going to be unlike ratification debates in other states because it looked, if not evenly divided, it looked as if the abilities of each side were evenly distributed. And the opponents, these anti-federalists, were led, or at least it seemed as if they may be led, by a man that's Thomas Jefferson simultaneously disliked and distrusted, and yet said without hesitation that he was the greatest orator that ever lived, Patrick Henry. So the potential for the opponents to build momentum was certainly there. As delegates from the state gathered in Richmond on Sunday, June 1st, stagecoach companies were running extra coaches from Williamsburg and Fredericksburg to accommodate the rush of people heading into Richmond. Both delegates, there would be ultimately 170 or so, both delegates and people that were going to attend as spectators. It looked as if there was going to be a serious and learned and energetic debate. The growing literature of the ratification debates is really building by this time. The The first Federalist essays, the first volume, appeared in Virginia in April of 1788, would help to inform and shape the conversation. But more than any other factor, it really was Henry that would shape the conversation, shape the debate in Virginia. The convention would meet for almost all of the month of June, 1788, and even more than Madison, the man we often call the father of the Constitution, Henry set the terms of discussion. He dictated what was discussed, when it was discussed, by sheer will. Edmund Pendleton was asked to preside over the state ratifying convention, though most of the debates would take place with him sitting as a member of the assembly of this ratifying convention, because they would take place as a committee of the whole, where they would gather as a committee. It freed up the rules of debates. Members could speak multiple times on an issue rather than waiting their turn, that kind of thing. They would debate spend most of their time over the month of June in a committee of the whole. And Henry took full advantage of these opportunities to speak multiple times on a single issue. He hit early and fast. He tried and failed on day one, perhaps day two, the first day of substantive debate, to get the assembly to begin by reading the resolutions that had dispatched delegates to Philadelphia in the first place, which, as you know, were resolutions that sent people to consider amendments to the Articles of Confederation. Henry knew that this might be a good way to point out to people that the Philadelphia Convention had exceeded their instructions. It would become instantly clear that this proposed Constitution was an exceptional and potentially dangerous document. But he could not get that passed, and it's beginning, the energy is beginning to build from that moment on. Once debate began on the Constitution, he wouldn't, and this had happened in other states, even let the preamble pass unscathed. He said, why does it say we the people and not we the states? Why are we risking, and this was an important point for Henry, why are we risking a fundamental innovation like this when here in Virginia, and he was conscious of Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts and insurrections and dangers elsewhere, but here in Virginia things look to be going okay. He said there are no dangers, no insurrection or tumult here in Virginia. Why consider something so radical? Edmund Randolph would answer him. And remember, Edmund Randolph was one of the men who refused to sign the Constitution the past September. And he stated then something that he believed the previous year, that the nation did need a more energetic government. It needed a centralized government that could deal with issues more effectively. And he said any problems that we see in this particular plan should be fixed by amendment, but perhaps we should seize this moment. We should ratify our new Constitution and amend it after we've created a more effective framework of government. George Mason, too, another man who would not sign it in Philadelphia, is beginning to rise up and to tell Henry that while this document isn't perfect, we shouldn't scuttle the whole enterprise here and now. But Henry wouldn't be assuaged, and I want to give some sense of Henry's effectiveness as an orator. He, on June 5th, as the convention is just getting going, stands up and gives a speech that was extraordinarily moving for everyone there, including people in the gallery, people observing. He said, here is a revolution, and he's talking about this new proposed Constitution. Here is a revolution as radical as that which separated us from Great Britain. It is as radical if in this transition our rights and privileges are endangered, the sovereignty of the states be relinquished. And cannot we plainly see that this is actually the case? The right of conscience, trial by jury, liberty of the press, all your immunities and franchises, all pretensions to human rights and privileges are rendered insecure, if not lost, by this change so loudly talked of by some and inconsiderately by others. Is this tame relinquishment of rights worthy of freemen? One spectator in the gallery on June 5th reported that he had involuntarily reached to feel his wrists to assure himself that fetters weren't already pressing into his flesh. Henry's moving the people, he's moving the galleries. There were concerns that he'd be moving the members of the ratifying convention as well. A couple of notes to think about, big picture things. Henry was in his 50s at this time, and he and others like him in Virginia who opposed the Constitution, or men like George Mason opposed it to an extent, were unwilling to sign it in Philadelphia, but were supporting ratification at this point. These were men who were born in the 1720s and 1730s, men who had come into political maturity under the British government, had seen the struggles against British tyranny. They worried seriously that a more naive and younger generation was taking them down the wrong path, because many of the people supporting this Constitution, if you think about just James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, were men in their 30s, right? Men who came into political maturity during the Revolution, had at best vague recollections of British rule. And potentially these men in their 30s were about to fritter away the rights of the people that had been dearly won in the 1770s and with the conclusion of the war in 1783. And so the convention proceeded. After several days of more abstract argument and debate, the members began to debate the Constitution line by line. This would happen in many of the state conventions, with Madison in attendance, essentially playing the part of the chief analyst, expositor of what each line meant, the implications of each clause or phrase. The potential for an abuse of power was, as you can glean from Patrick Henry's speech, a running refrain. This could destroy our liberties. Not necessarily that it would, but that it could. And that debate, these discussions would grow ridiculous at times. Madison probably nearly lost his patience when one member began to list reasons that a federal district, right, what we now call the District of Columbia, was this terribly destructive potential, had this terribly destructive potential. He said it would become the sanctuary of the blackest crimes, for no state laws could intervene there. Even fugitive slaves could flee into this district, this federal district, because Article 4 of this proposed Constitution only guaranteed that fugitive slaves would be returned if they ran into another state, and yet somehow this federal district didn't seem to fit that definition. Madison and others patiently responded, surely tired of this idea, right, that any potential to be abused certainly meant that the whole constitutional framework was dangerous and destructive. He and others tried to calm down the discussions. Days and weeks passed in the month of June until as late as June 22nd. James Madison wouldn't speculate as to what the outcome would be. He was that uncertain. It wasn't a clear direction from day one, the way that it was in some state assemblies where you could see people gathering and you would know in advance which way they were leaning. Virginia seemed to be up for grabs, Patrick Henry single-handedly being responsible for some of that uncertainty. On June 24th, things appeared to be headed towards some kind of close when George Wythe, who was one of the most learned men in Virginia, this was Thomas Jefferson's mentor, John Marshall's mentor, moved to ratify the Constitution. Henry did what he could. He rose to speak, and this is one of those moments that we maybe don't know about it as much as we would as if he had carried the day, because Henry gave an extraordinarily moving speech, and he gave it at a time that a thunderstorm was rolling into Richmond. And as the thunderstorm's rolling in, he begins speaking that he sees in this Constitution the awful immensity of the dangers with which it is pregnant. I see it, I feel it. And then as thunder's cracking, he begins to say that beings of a higher order, he's talking about angels or God, are anxious concerning our decision. Those intelligent beings which inhabit the ethereal mansions are watching. And he says that much depends here. This is a crucial moment in human history, and he says it clearly, that half of humanity will be affected by the decision that we make. It was a rousing moment, but Henry at this point it's beginning to become apparent that he's going to be on a losing side, because the next day, on June 25th, the crucial vote came. Henry moved that the convention recommend changes, especially the Bill of Rights, to all of the other states before voting to ratify this Constitution. And that was the key issue. Would they ratify before proposing amendments, or would they wait until amendments had been passed? And so as this vote comes up on June 25th, clearly the crucial one, it failed 88 votes to 80. Wythe's motion to ratify quickly followed, passing 89 to 79. The largest state in America had ratified the new Constitution, but again, it was an extraordinarily near-run thing. There were a few delegates from what becomes Kentucky that had yet to arrive, that had not arrived. It does look as if, even if they had arrived, and these were, as was often the case, men in the West were more suspicious of the Constitution. It does look as if, even if they had arrived, Virginia would have had a bare majority for ratification, but it was extraordinarily close. Before the convention was done, however, it would develop a list of proposed amendments, as some of the other states had done, to be considered and encouraged by the legal representatives under the new government. They came up with 20, including a revised version of their own 1776 Virginia Declaration of Rights. And these would serve to be an important component of what becomes the Bill of Rights. One interesting bit of news came by express rider into Alexandria just 3 days after Richmond had ratified the Constitution. And that news was from New Hampshire. New Hampshire had beat them to the punch, had become the 9th state to ratify the Constitution, bringing it into effect. They voted to ratify on June 21st, and Virginia followed just a few days later. It was New Hampshire then that became what they said was the 9th pillar of the new federal edifice. Virginia became the 10th. So New Hampshire put it into effect, but without Virginia, it almost certainly would have been a dangerous and far-flung possibility that this new constitutional framework could ever have really gone into effect. And if 4 or 5 votes had swung the other way, Virginia may have voted it down. Patrick Henry almost single-handedly shaped the debate, shaped the discussion, and got people thinking seriously about this Constitution as a potential danger to the liberties, not a protector, but a danger to the liberties of the people. In Virginia, finally, we have not just the number of states required to ratify the Constitution, but all of the key states coming into place, with one exception: New York remained. Thank you.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.